The black SUV came up the winding lakeside road far too fast for a road that ended at the water. Sarah Miller heard it before she saw it. She was kneeling beside a flower bed outside Lakeside Cottage, pulling weeds from beneath a row of bright yellow daisies, when the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the peaceful silence of Crystal Lake. It immediately caught her attention. Nobody was supposed to arrive until June 20th. The summer renters for Lakeview House weren't expected for another 2 weeks. The property was ready. The bedrooms had been aired out. The kitchen had been cleaned. Fresh linens were folded upstairs. The brass key to the main house sat exactly where it always sat inside an antique clock in the entry hall. Everything was prepared. Everything except this unexpected visitor. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and stood. Behind her, 7-year-old Lily sat on the cottage porch with colored pencils scattered around her feet. She was drawing another picture of Crystal Lake, something she did almost every day. The little girl noticed her mother's expression. "Mom." Sarah raised one finger. Lily immediately understood. She had been taught the rule years ago. If a stranger arrives, stay where Mom can see you. The SUV finally came into view. A sleek black Cadillac Escalade. Definitely not the type of vehicle most summer visitors drove. The vehicle rolled to a stop near the main gate. A moment later, the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out. The first thing Sarah noticed was how expensive he looked. Not flashy, not loud, just expensive. The dark blue jacket fit perfectly. The leather shoes probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. And the silver watch on his wrist reflected the afternoon sunlight like a tiny mirror. The man looked toward the large white house sitting on the hill, then toward the cottage, then directly at Sarah. "Lakeview House?" he asked. His voice was calm, polished, and confident. Sarah nodded toward the hill. "That's Lakeview House." The man looked relieved. For about 3 seconds. Then Sarah added, "But it isn't open yet." His expression changed. "What?" "The summer rental doesn't begin until June 20th. The stranger frowned. For a moment he looked genuinely confused. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed several printed documents. He walked closer and handed them to her. Sarah glanced at the paperwork. Her eyes stopped on the name. Ethan Carter. She knew the name immediately. Everyone did. Ethan Carter owned Carter Hospitality Group, one of the largest luxury hotel companies in America. The man was worth hundreds of millions, maybe more. Sarah continued reading. The booking showed Lakeview House, June 6th through August 31st. Everything appeared correct, except the date. Sarah looked up. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. The booking system must have made a mistake." Ethan took the papers back. "What kind of mistake?" "The house isn't available yet." He stared at the property, then at the cottage, then back at the property. The silence lasted several seconds. Finally, Lily's voice floated across the yard. "Mom." Sarah turned. Lily had abandoned her drawing and was now standing on the porch. The little girl tilted her head. "Is he lost?" Sarah nearly laughed. The question was so innocent, so direct. Ethan looked toward the child. Something softened in his face. "Just slightly. I think I might be." Lily nodded seriously. "That happens to me sometimes too." Sarah smiled despite herself. The little girl seemed satisfied by the answer and sat back down with her drawing. Ethan looked back toward the lake. The water stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. Crystal Lake looked exactly the way it appeared on postcards. Quiet, peaceful, beautiful, and completely disconnected from the world he had left behind. "Can the rental company fix this today?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "The office closes for lunch until 2. Ethan checked his watch. It was barely noon. The billionaire sighed quietly. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just tired. Sarah noticed that. She had expected frustration. Maybe demands. Maybe phone calls. Maybe threats. Instead, he simply stood there staring at the water, like a man who suddenly had nowhere to be. "If you want," Sarah said carefully, "you can wait on the porch until they reopen." Ethan looked surprised. "You're sure? There are chairs." "Thank you." The words sounded genuine. That surprised her. He climbed the porch steps and sat in the far corner. He didn't take out a laptop. He didn't make a phone call. He didn't start issuing instructions. Instead, he simply looked out across Crystal Lake, as though he had forgotten what stillness looked like. Several minutes passed. Then Lily walked over. Sarah watched closely. The little girl stopped a safe distance away. "What's your name?" Ethan. I'm Lily. Nice to meet you, Lily. She pointed toward the large house on the hill. My mom takes care of that house. Ethan nodded. She's very good at it. Lily smiled proudly. I know. Sarah rolled her eyes. The billionaire actually laughed. A small laugh. Brief, but real. Then Lily pointed at his watch. That looks expensive. Sarah almost choked. Lily, what? The child asked innocently. Ethan looked at the watch. Then at Lily. It was my father's. Oh. Lily considered that information carefully. Then nodded. Then it's important. Ethan looked down at the watch again. For the first time since arriving, his smile disappeared. Yes, he said quietly. It is. Sarah noticed something in his expression. A sadness that didn't belong to a man who owned luxury hotels. A sadness that had clearly been there long before he arrived at Crystal Lake. She looked away. Whatever burden Ethan Carter carried wasn't her business. By evening, the rental company would fix the mistake. Tomorrow he'd be gone. Back to New York. Back to his meetings. Back to his world. And life at Lakeside Cottage would return to normal. At least that was what Sarah believed. She had no idea that this unexpected visitor would soon change her life, Lily's life, and even his own in ways none of them could imagine. Welcome to Super Stories. If you're enjoying this heartwarming story, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Whether you're in the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, or anywhere else in the world. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Ethan Carter was still sitting on the porch. The rental company had finally answered his call. Unfortunately, the news wasn't good. Sarah watched through the kitchen window while preparing dinner. Ethan stood near the porch railing with his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. But somehow that seemed worse. The kind of men who shouted usually lost control. The kind who stayed calm were often the ones truly disappointed. 10 minutes later, the call ended. Ethan lowered the phone and stared out at Crystal Lake. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he walked toward the cottage. Sarah looked up from the stove when he knocked lightly on the screen door. They found the problem, he said. And the booking system mixed up 2 properties. Sarah folded her arms. That's unfortunate. The house I was supposed to rent is in another town. Can you go there? Not immediately. What happened? The owner is overseas. The caretaker can't be reached. Nobody knows where the keys are. Sarah blinked. Seriously? Apparently. For the first time, Ethan looked almost embarrassed. The rental company offered me a hotel. And I don't want a hotel. Sarah waited. She had a feeling there was more. There was. I planned to spend the entire summer away from New York. She said nothing. I specifically wanted a lake. Still nothing. The reason I rented the property was because it was isolated. Sarah stirred the soup. Mr. Carter. Ethan. Mr. Carter. That earned the faintest smile. The house belongs to someone else. I don't make decisions about rentals. I understand. Good. But, there it was. Sarah sighed. But, Ethan glanced toward the old boathouse near the water. The small structure sat beside the dock. Above it was a simple loft apartment used occasionally by maintenance workers. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't even particularly comfortable. But it was dry and private. The loft above the boathouse, Ethan said. Sarah stared. What about it? Could I rent it until the owners arrive? For several seconds she simply looked at him. Then she laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. You want to rent the boathouse loft? Yes. It has a cot. I've slept on worse. It doesn't have a proper bathroom. I can manage. The shower is here. I'll use it when convenient. The air conditioner barely works. I'm from New York. I survived summer subway stations. Sarah fought a smile. Ethan continued. I'll stay completely out of your way. Mr. Carter. Ethan. She ignored that. I have a daughter. His expression softened immediately. I know. And that matters. It should. Sarah studied him carefully. For the first time she noticed something unusual. Ethan wasn't trying to convince her. He wasn't pressuring her. He wasn't using his money. He was simply asking. Like someone who expected the answer to be no. How long? She asked. 2 weeks. And after that, I leave immediately. You won't enter the main house. I won't. You won't bring visitors. I won't. You won't come near Lily unless I'm present. Of course. Sarah looked away toward the lake. The cottage needed repairs. Bills were piling up. Summer wasn't cheap. Being a single mother never was. The extra income would help. A lot. Still, a stranger was a stranger, especially one as wealthy as Ethan Carter. Before she could answer, a small voice interrupted. "Can he stay?" Both adults turned. Lily stood in the doorway holding her drawing pad. Sarah sighed. "Lily, what?" "This is an adult conversation." "I know." The little girl pointed toward Ethan. "He seems lonely." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Especially Ethan. For a brief second, Sarah saw something flash across his face. Pain. Quick. Hidden. Gone. But definitely there. Lily continued. "And he fixed my pencil." "What?" Ethan looked embarrassed. "The blue pencil broke." "You fixed it?" It seemed urgent. Lily nodded seriously. "It was." Sarah closed her eyes. This was becoming impossible. Finally she looked at Ethan. "If I say yes, there will be rules. I'll follow them. Every single one." "I understand." "I mean it." "So do I." Silence settled between them. Then Sarah nodded once. "Fine." Lily cheered immediately. Sarah pointed a finger. "This is not your victory." "It feels like it." Ethan laughed quietly. The sound surprised all three of them. By 6 o'clock, Sarah had written a full page of rules. Ethan signed every one. By 7, he had carried his luggage into the loft. By 8, he was eating homemade chicken soup on the porch while Lily explained the names of every duck on the lake. By 9, the lights came on inside the boathouse. Sarah stood outside her cottage watching the glow reflect across the water. The summer breeze moved gently through the trees. Everything looked peaceful, normal, safe. Yet something felt different. A billionaire from New York was sleeping in a tiny loft above her boathouse. And somehow that fact worried her less than it should have. Inside the loft, Ethan unpacked slowly. The room was small. One bed, one desk, one lamp, one window overlooking Crystal Lake. Nothing like the places he normally stayed. Yet for some reason, it felt easier to breathe there. He sat on the edge of the cot and loosened his tie. For the first time in years, nobody was calling him. No board meetings. No investors. No interviews. No endless problems demanding solutions. Just silence. Real silence. Ethan looked out the window. Across the water he could see the lights inside Sarah's cottage. A mother and daughter finishing another ordinary day. The kind of ordinary life he hadn't experienced in decades. Down below, gentle waves touched the dock. The sound echoed softly through the wooden beams. Ethan removed his watch and held it in his hand. His father's watch. The one thing he never traveled without. For a long moment he stared at it. Then he placed it beside the bed and turned off the light. Outside, Crystal Lake shimmered beneath the moon. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Carter fell asleep without thinking about work. He didn't know it yet, but the best chapter of his life had just begun. Ethan woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, he didn't know where he was. Then he heard the lake. Water gently touching the dock. Birds calling from the trees. The soft creak of the boathouse beneath him. And suddenly he remembered. Crystal Lake. The cottage. Sarah. Lily. The wrong rental. The strange feeling that he had somehow ended up exactly where he was supposed to be. He sat up slowly. The loft window was glowing with the pale blue light of dawn. For the first time in years, he had slept through the entire night. No phone calls. No emails. No emergency meetings. No nightmares about quarterly reports. Just sleep. Real sleep. Ethan checked his phone. 23 notifications. All from one person. Victoria. His sister. He stared at the screen. Then locked it again. Not today. At least not yet. He climbed down from the loft and stepped onto the dock. Crystal Lake looked like polished glass. The world felt still. Peaceful. And somehow much larger than Manhattan. A voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. Coffee. He turned. Sarah stood on the porch holding a mug. Her hair was tied back. She looked like she'd already been awake for hours. Good morning, Ethan said. Morning. She handed him the coffee. He accepted it. Thank you. You look like you needed it. I do. Sarah glanced at the phone in his hand. Still ignoring New York? Ethan smiled faintly. Trying. How's that going? Poorly. She nodded. Then drink the coffee first. For some reason, that made him laugh. A real laugh. Not the polite kind. Not the boardroom kind. An actual laugh. Sarah looked surprised. So you do know how? Apparently. They stood quietly for a moment. Across the dock, Lily lay flat on her stomach, dangling one hand into the water. "What are you doing?" Ethan called. "Looking for fish. See any?" "No." "Then how do you know they're there?" Lily shrugged. "They live here." It was the kind of answer only a child could give. And somehow it made perfect sense. By mid-morning, Crystal Lake had already heard about Ethan Carter. Small towns worked that way. Nobody knew exactly how information traveled. It simply did. By 11 o'clock, 3 different versions of the story were circulating. Version 1. A billionaire had secretly purchased Lakeview House. Version 2. A famous movie producer was hiding from reporters. Version 3. Sarah Miller had married a millionaire without telling anyone. That version was Margaret Wilson's favorite, mostly because it annoyed Sarah. Around noon, Margaret decided she needed answers. Personally, she marched up the cottage path carrying a paper bag filled with blueberry muffins. Sarah opened the door and immediately sighed. "Margaret." "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "Community service." Sarah laughed. "You came to investigate." "I came to bring muffins." "You came to investigate while carrying muffins." Margaret smiled proudly. "Exactly." A few moments later, she spotted Ethan sitting on the dock reading a thick binder. Her eyes narrowed. There he is. Sarah knew that look. Margaret was about to become impossible. The elderly woman walked straight toward the dock. "Ethan Carter." Ethan looked up. Margaret waved a muffin. He looked confused. "Yes, I'm Margaret Wilson. Nice to meet you." "I'm sure." She sat beside him without invitation. Ethan looked toward Sarah for help. Sarah pretended not to notice. "You own hotels?" Margaret asked. "Yes. Several. Quite a few." "You rich?" Ethan blinked. "Margaret." "What?" she asked. Sarah covered her face. Ethan surprised them both by smiling. "A little. A little." Margaret laughed. "Honey, you arrived in a vehicle worth more than my first house." For the next 20 minutes, she questioned him about everything. His business, his childhood, his favorite food, whether he could fish, whether he could cook, whether he intended to break Sarah's heart. That last question nearly killed him. Sarah almost dropped a plate. Lily thought it was hilarious. Margaret remained completely serious. Finally, Ethan answered. "I don't intend to break anyone's heart." Margaret studied him carefully, then nodded. "Good." And just like that, the interrogation ended, as if he'd passed some invisible test. That afternoon, Ethan drove into town. When he returned, his SUV was carrying lumber, paint, tools, and several bags from the local hardware store. Sarah stepped onto the porch. "What did you buy?" Ethan looked guilty. "Supplies." "For what?" He pointed toward the porch. The second damaged board. The one Sarah had been ignoring for months. "No." "Sarah." "No. The board is dangerous. It can wait." "It has waited." Sarah folded her arms. Ethan folded his. Neither moved. Lily appeared in the doorway. "Mama." "What?" "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The stubborn face." Ethan tried not to laugh. Sarah glared at both of them. Then she pointed at Ethan. "One board. One board. That's it. That's it." Lily pumped her fist like her team had won a championship. The repair took most of the afternoon. Lily became Ethan's official assistant. Her responsibilities included holding screws, naming tools incorrectly, and providing commentary. By sunset, the board was finished. The porch looked better than it had in years. Sarah stood quietly, examining the work. "It looks good." Ethan wiped sawdust from his hands. "Thank you. You've done this before." "My grandfather taught me." "When?" "When I was about Lily's age." Something about the answer felt heavier than it should have. Sarah noticed. She noticed a lot of things these days, like how Ethan touched his watch whenever he was thinking, or how he looked away whenever someone asked about family, or how loneliness seemed to follow him even when he smiled. Before she could ask anything, Ethan's phone buzzed. "Victoria." Again. This time he answered. "Victoria." The voice that exploded through the speaker was loud enough for Sarah to hear from 10 feet away. "Ethan Carter, where are you?" Sarah nearly laughed. Ethan looked exhausted. "Good evening to you too. You disappeared." "I'm at the lake." "I know you're at a lake." "No, I'm at the lake." Victoria paused. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm staying." "Ethan." "I'm staying." Another pause. Longer this time. "Lynn Victoria site." The sound carried all the way through the phone. I suppose you're happy. Ethan looked toward the cottage. Sarah was helping Lily gather crayons from the porch. The evening sunlight surrounded them both. For a brief moment, the scene felt like a painting. Simple, ordinary, beautiful. More beautiful than anything he'd seen in years. Yeah, Ethan said quietly. I think I am. The call ended. Victoria said nothing else. But Ethan had a feeling she was already planning a visit. And knowing his sister, that visit was going to happen very soon. He just didn't know it would change everything. The next morning began with pancakes. Not because it was Sunday. Not because there was a guest staying in the boathouse. Simply because Lily loved pancakes. That was Sarah's explanation anyway. The truth was a little more complicated. Over the past week, Ethan had somehow become part of their mornings. Coffee on the porch. Conversations by the lake. Lily's endless questions. The rhythm felt natural. Too natural. And that made Sarah nervous. She had spent years rebuilding her life after Lily's father left. Years learning how to depend on no one but herself. Now a billionaire was eating breakfast in her kitchen. That should have felt strange. Instead, it felt comfortable, which was far more dangerous. Ethan walked into the kitchen just as Sarah placed a fresh stack of pancakes on the table. The smell immediately stopped him. You make these every morning? No. Good. Why? Because if I ate these every morning, I'd need bigger pants. Lily laughed so hard she nearly dropped her fork. Sarah rolled her eyes. You've been spending too much time with my daughter. I was about to say the same thing about you. For a brief moment their eyes met. Neither looked away immediately. Neither seemed to know what to do with that. Fortunately, Lily saved them. Mom. Yes. If Ethan learns how to canoe, can he stay forever? Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. Ethan looked fascinated by his pancake. The screen door suddenly opened. All three turned. A woman stepped inside. Elegant, confident, perfectly dressed, and completely out of place in a small lakeside kitchen. Victoria Carter had arrived. She took one look at Ethan sitting at the table, then at the pancakes, then at Sarah and Lily. Her expression froze. Ethan, her brother, closed his eyes. Good morning, Victoria. I drove 6 hours. I noticed. Victoria looked around the kitchen. The yellow curtains, the family photos, the crayons on the table, the half-finished puzzle near the window. None of this belonged to Ethan's world. And yet he looked more relaxed than she had seen him in years. That frightened her, because it meant something had changed. Something important. Sarah stood. I'm Sarah Miller. Victoria immediately shifted into polite mode. The version she used at charity events and board meetings. Victoria Carter. Ethan's sister. They shook hands. Then Victoria turned back to Ethan. We need to talk. 10 minutes later, brother and sister stood at the end of the dock. Sarah could see them through the kitchen window. She couldn't hear them, but she could read body language. Victoria was frustrated. Ethan was calm. That alone told her who was winning the argument. At one point, Victoria gestured dramatically toward the cottage. Ethan shook his head. Then Victoria pointed toward New York. Again, Ethan shook his head. Finally, she crossed her arms. Defeated. When they returned, Victoria looked less angry and more curious. Lily was the first to approach her. Are you Ethan's sister? Victoria blinked. Yes. Really? Lily studied her carefully. You look like him. Victoria laughed unexpectedly. That's usually how siblings work. Lily nodded. That makes sense. For the next half hour, Lily asked questions nonstop. What was New York like? Did Victoria live in a skyscraper? Had she ever met celebrities? Did rich people really eat caviar? Victoria answered every question, even the ridiculous ones. Especially the ridiculous ones. And slowly something happened. The cold businesswoman disappeared. The older sister emerged. The woman who had helped raise Ethan after their parents' marriage fell apart. The woman who had spent years protecting him from everyone, including himself. Later that afternoon, Victoria sat alone on the porch. Sarah joined her. For a while neither spoke. Finally Victoria broke the silence. He's different here. Sarah looked toward the dock. Ethan and Lily were trying to teach a turtle how to appreciate crackers. The turtle seemed unconvinced. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Victoria smiled sadly. I've spent 10 years watching my brother work. She paused. They both could tell something. Sarah listened quietly. His name was Lily. Never talked. But I haven't seen her happy all the way. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Victoria continued. When he was younger, he used to laugh. She watched Ethan across the lake. He doesn't laugh much anymore. At that exact moment, Lily said something. Ethan burst out laughing. A genuine laugh. The kind that came from deep inside. Both women heard it. Both looked toward him. And for a second neither spoke. Victoria's eyes glistened. Only slightly. But Sarah noticed. Because she understood. People didn't mourn only those who died. Sometimes they mourned the versions of people they used to know. That evening Victoria prepared to leave. Before getting into her car, she pulled Ethan aside. Sarah wasn't trying to listen. But some conversations carried. Just be careful, Victoria said softly. Ethan nodded. I know. No. Victoria shook her head. You don't. Ethan looked confused. His sister smiled sadly. That's exactly my point. She hugged him. Briefly. Tightly. Then she got into her car and drove away. As the taillights disappeared down the road, Ethan remained standing there. Watching. Thinking. Sarah joined him a few moments later. Everything okay? He nodded. I think so. You don't sound sure. Ethan looked out at Crystal Lake. The water reflected the orange colors of sunset. Beautiful. Quiet. Safe. I spent years believing success would solve everything. Sarah waited. It didn't. No. It solved different problems. Sarah smiled. That's life. He looked at her. You make everything sound simple. It usually is. They stood quietly together. The evening breeze moved across the water. Behind them, Lily chased fireflies through the yard. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Neither of them realized that trouble was already coming. And when it arrived, it would test everything they were beginning to build. The following week settled into a routine neither Sarah nor Ethan had planned. Mornings began with coffee. Afternoons ended at the dock. Evenings usually included Lily explaining some important discovery about ducks, turtles, clouds, or life in general. And somehow Ethan always listened like it mattered. Because to Lily it did. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself looking forward to tomorrow. That realization scared her. She tried not to think about it, but some truths refused to stay buried. One Tuesday afternoon, Ethan sat at the kitchen table reviewing documents. Sarah was washing dishes. Lily was coloring at the far end of the room. The cottage felt peaceful. Until Ethan's phone rang. Victoria. Again. Ethan answered. A moment later, Sarah noticed something change. His expression tightened, then hardened, then disappeared completely. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, he stared at the screen. Silent. What happened? Sarah asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Finally, he looked up. My sister found something. Sarah dried her hands. What? The rental mistake. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. What about it? Ethan looked uncomfortable. Apparently, it wasn't a mistake. The room became very quiet. Even Lily stopped coloring. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Victoria had hired investigators. After reviewing emails, phone records, and booking confirmations, they discovered something unexpected. Months earlier, Ethan's longtime estate manager, a woman named Helen Brooks, had secretly redirected his reservation. Instead of confirming his luxury lake lodge near Albany, she had arranged for him to be booked at Lakeview House near Crystal Lake. Specifically here. Specifically this property. Specifically this summer. Sarah stared. Why? Ethan shook his head. Nobody knows yet. But Victoria intended to find out. 3 days later, she arrived at Crystal Lake carrying a large brown envelope. This time she didn't walk into the cottage. She knocked. Sarah opened the door. Victoria looked tired. More tired than before. I owe both of you an apology. Sarah stepped aside. Victoria entered. Ethan stood from the table. Neither sibling spoke for several moments. Then Victoria handed him the envelope. Read it. Ethan opened it. Inside were copies of emails, booking records, phone logs, and finally a handwritten letter from Helen Brooks, the woman who had worked for the Carter family for 22 years, the woman who had practically helped raise Ethan and Victoria, the woman they trusted. The letter was simple, painfully simple. It read, Ethan spent years building hotels for strangers while forgetting how to build a life for himself. I watched him become successful. I watched him become lonely. And I realized he didn't need another luxury lake house. He needed a home. So I sent him to the one place where I thought he might find one. The room went silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Sarah looked at Ethan. His eyes remained fixed on the letter. Finally he lowered it. She sent me here. Victoria nodded. Yes. On purpose. Yes. Ethan sat down slowly, like someone struggling to process something far bigger than a booking error. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about one sentence. He needed a home. For some reason it broke her heart. Because deep down she understood exactly what Helen had meant. Money could buy almost anything. But not belonging. Not family. Not peace. That evening, Victoria and Ethan walked to the end of the dock. The same place they always went when conversations mattered. Sarah stayed inside. This wasn't her moment. It belonged to them. Brother and sister stood facing the lake for a long time. Eventually Victoria spoke. You know she was wrong. Ethan nodded. I know. She manipulated everything. I know. People don't get to choose your life for you. Again he nodded. Victoria sighed. Then why aren't you angry? For a while he didn't answer. The sun was beginning to set. Golden light stretched across Crystal Lake. Finally Ethan spoke. Because if she hadn't done it. He stopped. Victoria waited. Ethan looked back toward the cottage. Through the kitchen window he could see Sarah helping Lily with homework. Both were laughing about something. The sight made him smile. If she hadn't done it, he said quietly, I never would have come here. Victoria followed his gaze. And suddenly she understood. Not everything, but enough. When they returned to the cottage, Victoria surprised everyone, especially Sarah. She walked directly to her, then extended her hand. I'm sorry. Sarah blinked. For what? For thinking you had something to do with this. Sarah looked confused. Victoria smiled weakly. When my brother first arrived, I assumed somebody wanted something from him. Sarah laughed. Trust me, the last thing I wanted was a billionaire living behind my house. Even Ethan laughed at that. Victoria nodded. Fair. Then she glanced toward Lily. The little girl was drawing again. As usual. What are you working on? Victoria asked. Lily proudly held up the paper. The drawing showed Sarah, the cottage, the lake, and Ethan, standing on the dock. Victoria stared at it. Then she looked at her brother. Then back at the picture. Interesting, she said. Lily nodded seriously. It's our family picture. The room froze. Sarah nearly dropped a cup. Victoria looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the ceiling. Neither seemed capable of speaking. Lily frowned. What? Nobody answered. The little girl shrugged and returned to coloring, as though she hadn't just changed the atmosphere in the entire room. That night Victoria left Crystal Lake. But before she got into her car, she pulled Sarah aside. I need to tell you something. Sarah waited. Victoria smiled softly. My brother has spent years surrounded by people. She glanced toward Ethan. Investors. Executives. Lawyers. Advisors. Then she looked back at Sarah. And somehow he's never looked more alone. Sarah listened quietly. Victoria's expression softened. Since coming here, he's different. Sarah looked away. Toward the cottage. Toward the lake. Toward the man standing on the porch talking to Lily. Victoria followed her gaze. Then smiled. Whatever happens next, she said. Thank you. A few moments later she drove away. And for the first time since arriving at Crystal Lake, Ethan stood watching the road not because he was waiting for someone to arrive, but because he was hoping nobody would interrupt what he had found. Neither he nor Sarah knew it yet, but the hardest part of their story was about to begin. August arrived quietly at Crystal Lake. The mornings were cooler. The sunsets lasted longer. And somehow, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, Ethan had become part of everyday life at Lakeside Cottage. He knew where Sarah kept the coffee filters. He knew Lily refused to eat the crusts of her sandwiches. He knew which step on the porch squeaked. And every Sunday morning, he made pancakes. The wrist motion was finally perfect. According to Lily, anyway. You're almost as good as Mom now, she announced one Wednesday morning. Almost, Ethan asked. Don't get carried away. Sarah laughed into her coffee. Ethan pretended to be offended. For a moment, everything felt easy. The kind of happiness that arrives quietly and makes itself at home. Then Ethan's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. His attorney. Not unusual. But when he answered, his expression changed immediately. Sarah noticed. The smile disappeared. The warmth disappeared. The peace disappeared. All at once. Ethan? Sarah asked. He looked up. I need to go back to New York. The words landed heavily. Lily stopped eating. Sarah sat very still. For how long? She asked. 3 days. 3 days. Maybe 4. What happened? Ethan ran a hand through his hair. There are issues with the acquisition. The merger? Yes. His voice sounded frustrated. Not because he wanted to go. Because he didn't. That part was obvious. Sarah looked toward the lake, trying to ignore the disappointment she suddenly felt. 3 days shouldn't matter. People left all the time. But somehow this felt different. Ethan stood. I'll be back before the community festival. Lily immediately pointed her fork at him. You better. Ethan smiled. I promise. You promised before I even asked. That's because I know you. Lily seemed satisfied. For the first time all morning. By noon, Ethan's SUV was packed. The suitcase went into the trunk. The laptop bag followed. Then came the awkward part. The goodbye. Ethan stood near the porch steps. Sarah stood opposite him. Neither seemed able to find the right words. Finally, Sarah spoke. You'll come back. It wasn't a question. Ethan looked at her. Then nodded. I'll come back. She believed him. At least she thought she did. Lily hugged him without hesitation. Don't forget. I won't. The festival. I know. The pancakes. I know. The canoe lessons. I know. The ducks. Ethan laughed. I definitely know. Finally, he got into the SUV. The vehicle disappeared down the road. Sarah stood watching long after it was gone. A strange emptiness settled over the cottage, like someone had quietly removed a piece of it. The trouble started 6 hours later. Margaret Wilson arrived carrying several printed pages. Her face looked serious. Very serious. Sarah immediately felt nervous. What happened? Margaret handed over the pages. Sarah looked down, then froze. There, on the front page of a financial news website, was a photograph. A photograph taken from somewhere across the lake. The image showed Ethan sitting on the cottage porch. Sarah beside him. Lily between them. Eating pancakes. Laughing. Looking exactly like a family. The headline made Sarah's stomach tighten. Billionaire Ethan Carter's secret summer life. She kept reading. Anonymous sources claimed Ethan was secretly involved with a woman living at Crystal Lake. Others suggested Lily was his daughter. Some reports claimed he was planning to abandon New York entirely. The story mixed truth, gossip, and outright lies so smoothly that it was hard to separate one from the other. None of it was true, but none of that mattered. The photograph looked convincing. Too convincing. Sarah sat down slowly. Who took this? Margaret shook her head. No idea. Lily looked up from the living room floor. What's wrong? Sarah immediately turned the papers face down. Nothing, sweetheart. But it wasn't nothing. Because once something appeared online, it spread. Fast. By evening, reporters had started calling local businesses. By sunset, strangers were asking questions around town. And by nightfall, Sarah's peaceful little world no longer felt private. At 8 o'clock, Ethan called. Sarah stared at the phone. It rang. And rang. And rang. She didn't answer. At 9, he called again. Still nothing. At 10, he left a voicemail. She didn't listen. At 11, he called once more. Margaret sat quietly at the kitchen table. Answer it. Sarah shook her head. I can't. Why? I don't know. But she did know. Fear. Old fear. The kind that arrives when happiness starts feeling real. The kind that whispers dangerous things in the middle of the night. Maybe this was never what you thought it was. At midnight, Sarah opened the article again. She reread every line, every rumor, every accusation. And one detail kept bothering her. The original booking mistake. Helen had arranged the rental. Now this photograph had appeared. The media somehow knew exactly where Ethan was. What if none of it had been an accident? The thought settled into her mind. And once it entered, it refused to leave. What if someone had planned everything? What if Helen wasn't the whole story? What if Ethan had known? What if the wrong booking, the unexpected arrival, and the photograph were all pieces of the same puzzle? The more she thought about it, the more the doubts grew. By 2 in the morning, she had convinced herself of something she desperately didn't want to believe. Maybe she and Lily had simply become part of someone else's carefully arranged summer. The possibility hurt far more than she expected. Because somewhere along the way, she had stopped thinking of Ethan as a guest, and started thinking of him as something much harder to lose. The next morning, Sarah packed a suitcase. Just one. Lily watched silently. Are we going somewhere? Sarah nodded. Grandma's house. For vacation? Something like that. Lily looked toward the boathouse. Shouldn't we tell Ethan? Sarah swallowed hard. Then she sat down at the kitchen table. She pulled a sheet of paper toward her. For several minutes she stared at it. Finally she wrote, Ethan, I don't know what to think right now. Please give me 3 days. Sarah. She left the note on the kitchen counter. Then she took Lily's hand. Together they left Crystal Lake. Neither looked back. That evening Ethan returned. Exhausted, frustrated, and desperate to explain. The acquisition crisis had been solved. The media leak had been traced. He had spent the entire drive imagining Sarah rolling her eyes at the ridiculous rumors. Instead, he walked into an empty cottage. Silence greeted him. No Lily. No Sarah. No coffee brewing in the kitchen. No laughter drifting in from the porch. Only a note. He picked it up. Read it once. Then again. Then a third time. The room suddenly felt colder. For a long moment he simply stood there. Alone. The kitchen still looked exactly the same. The cast iron pan sat beside the stove. Lily's colored pencils remained on the table. A half-finished drawing rested near the window. Yet somehow the entire place felt empty. Slowly Ethan removed his father's watch. The watch he wore every single day. The watch he had carried for almost 20 years. He placed it carefully beside Sarah's note. Then he stood there staring at both. The note, the watch, the silence. For the first time since arriving at Crystal Lake, Ethan Carter had absolutely no idea what to do next. And that terrified him. August arrived quietly at Crystal Lake. The mornings were cooler. The sunsets lasted longer. And somehow, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, Ethan had become part of everyday life at Lakeside Cottage. He knew where Sarah kept the coffee filters. He knew Lily refused to eat the crusts of her sandwiches. He knew which step on the porch squeaked. And every Sunday morning, he made pancakes. The wrist motion was finally perfect. According to Lily, anyway. You're almost as good as Mom now, she announced one Wednesday morning. Almost, Ethan asked. Don't get carried away. Sarah laughed into her coffee. Ethan pretended to be offended. For a moment, everything felt easy. The kind of happiness that arrives quietly and makes itself at home. Then Ethan's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. His attorney. Not unusual. But when he answered, his expression changed immediately. Sarah noticed. The smile disappeared. The warmth disappeared. The peace disappeared. All at once. Ethan? Sarah asked. He looked up. I need to go back to New York. The words landed heavily. Lily stopped eating. Sarah sat very still. For how long? She asked. 3 days. 3 days. Maybe 4. What happened? Ethan ran a hand through his hair. There are issues with the acquisition. The merger. Yes. His voice sounded frustrated. Not because he wanted to go. Because he didn't. That part was obvious. Sarah looked toward the lake, trying to ignore the disappointment she suddenly felt. 3 days shouldn't matter. People left all the time. But somehow this felt different. Ethan stood. I'll be back before the community festival. Lily immediately pointed her fork at him. You better. Ethan smiled. I promise. You promised before I even asked. That's because I know you. Lily seemed satisfied. For the first time all morning. By noon, Ethan's SUV was packed. The suitcase went into the trunk. The laptop bag followed. Then came the awkward part. The goodbye. Ethan stood near the porch steps. Sarah stood opposite him. Neither seemed able to find the right words. Finally Sarah spoke. You'll come back. It wasn't a question. Ethan looked at her. Then nodded. I'll come back. She believed him. At least she thought she did. Lily hugged him without hesitation. Don't forget. I won't. The festival. I know. The pancakes. I know. The canoe lessons. I know. The ducks. Ethan laughed. I definitely will. Finally he got his answer. The vehicle disappeared from the road. Sarah stood watching along. A strange emptiness settled in her heart. Like someone had quietly removed a piece of it. The trouble started 6 hours later. Margaret Wilson arrived carrying several printed pages. Her face looked serious. Very serious. Sarah immediately felt nervous. What happened? Margaret handed over the pages. Sarah looked down, then froze. There, on the front page of a financial news website, was a photograph. A photograph taken from somewhere across the lake. The image showed Ethan sitting on the cottage porch. Sarah beside him. Lily between them. Eating pancakes. Laughing. looking exactly like a family. The headline made Sarah's stomach tighten. Billionaire Ethan Carter's secret summer life. She kept reading. Anonymous sources claimed Ethan was secretly involved with a woman living at Crystal Lake. Others suggested Lily was his daughter. Some reports claimed he was planning to abandon New York entirely. The story mixed truth, gossip, and outright lies so smoothly that it was hard to separate one from the other. None of it was true, but none of that mattered. The photograph looked convincing. Too convincing. Sarah sat down slowly. Who took this? Margaret shook her head. No idea. Lily looked up from the living room floor. What's wrong? Sarah immediately turned the papers face down. Nothing, sweetheart. But it wasn't nothing. Because once something appeared online, it spread. Fast. By evening, reporters had started calling local businesses. By sunset, strangers were asking questions around town. And by nightfall, Sarah's peaceful little world no longer felt private. At 8 o'clock, Ethan called. Sarah stared at the phone. It rang. And rang. And rang. She didn't answer. At 9, he called again. Still nothing. At 10, he left a voicemail. She didn't listen. At 11, he called once more. Margaret sat quietly at the kitchen table. Answer it. Sarah shook her head. I can't. Why? I don't know. But she did know. Fear. Old fear. The kind that arrives when happiness starts feeling real. The kind that whispers dangerous things in the middle of the night. Maybe this was never what you thought it was. At midnight, Sarah opened the article again. She reread every line, every rumor, every accusation. And one detail kept bothering her. The original booking mistake. Helen had arranged the rental. Now this photograph had appeared. The media somehow knew exactly where Ethan was. What if none of it had been an accident? The thought settled into her mind. And once it entered, it refused to leave. What if someone had planned everything? What if Helen wasn't the whole story? What if Ethan had known? What if the wrong booking, the unexpected arrival, and the photograph were all pieces of the same puzzle? The more she thought about it, the more the doubts grew. By 2 in the morning, she had convinced herself of something she desperately didn't want to believe. Maybe she and Lily had simply become part of someone else's carefully arranged summer. The possibility hurt far more than she expected. Because somewhere along the way, she had stopped thinking of Ethan as a guest and started thinking of him as something much harder to lose. The next morning, Sarah packed a suitcase. Just one. Lily watched silently. Are we going somewhere? Sarah nodded. Grandma's house. For vacation? Something like that. Lily looked toward the boathouse. Shouldn't we tell Ethan? Sarah swallowed hard. Then she sat down at the kitchen table. She pulled a sheet of paper toward her. For several minutes she stared at it. Finally she wrote, Ethan, I don't know what to think right now. Please give me 3 days. Sarah. She left the note on the kitchen counter. Then she took Lily's hand. Together they left Crystal Lake. Neither looked back. That evening Ethan returned. Exhausted, frustrated, and desperate to explain. The acquisition crisis had been solved. The media leak had been traced. He had spent the entire drive imagining Sarah rolling her eyes at the ridiculous rumors. Instead, he walked into an empty cottage. Silence greeted him. No Lily. No Sarah. No coffee brewing in the kitchen. No laughter drifting in from the porch. Only a note. He picked it up. Read it once. Then again. Then a third time. The room suddenly felt colder. For a long moment he simply stood there. Alone. The kitchen still looked exactly the same. The cast iron pan sat beside the stove. Lily's colored pencils remained on the table. A half-finished drawing rested near the window. Yet somehow the entire place felt empty. Slowly Ethan removed his father's watch. The watch he wore every single day. The watch he had carried for almost 20 years. He placed it carefully beside Sarah's note. Then he stood there staring at both. The note. The watch. The silence. For the first time since arriving at Crystal Lake, Ethan Carter had absolutely no idea what to do next. And that terrified him. The first night without Sarah and Lily was the longest night Ethan Carter could remember. He didn't stay in the cottage. He couldn't. Every room carried a memory. The kitchen reminded him of pancakes. The porch reminded him of coffee at sunrise. The dock reminded him of evenings spent listening to Lily explain things she barely understood with complete confidence. So he walked. For nearly 2 hours. Alone. The summer air was warm, but the lake felt strangely cold. Eventually he returned to the boathouse loft. The same loft he had arrived in as a stranger. the same loft that had somehow become home. He sat on the edge of the cot and stared out the window toward the cottage. No lights, no laughter, nothing, just darkness. For the first time since arriving at Crystal Lake, he wished he had never come. Not because the summer had been bad, because it had been too good, and now he had something to lose. The next morning, Ethan drove into town. Margaret Wilson was already waiting at the post office, almost as if she'd known he was coming, which, honestly, she probably had. Small towns work that way. She looked up as he entered. "You look terrible." "Good morning to you too. You didn't sleep?" "No." Margaret nodded. "I figured." Ethan sat heavily in the chair opposite her desk. For several moments neither spoke. Then Margaret slid a cup of coffee toward him. He accepted it gratefully. "Did Sarah say anything before she left?" he asked. Margaret studied him carefully. "No. Nothing. Nothing she'd want repeated." That answer somehow made things worse. Ethan looked toward the window. "I don't think she trusts me anymore." Margaret snorted. "You really are rich." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you've spent too much time around people who solve problems with money." He looked confused. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Trust isn't broken because somebody gets scared." Ethan listened. "Trust breaks when people stop caring." The elderly woman pointed toward him. "That woman cared enough to get scared." The words settled somewhere deep inside him. Margaret continued. "Give her the 3 days. What if she doesn't come back?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Then you'll survive." Ethan looked down at his coffee. "And if she does?" The smile widened. "Then stop being an idiot." Meanwhile, Sarah wasn't sleeping much either. Her grandmother's house sat outside Saratoga in a quiet neighborhood filled with old maple trees. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like waiting. Every room seemed too quiet. Every hour seemed too long. By the second day, Lily had finally asked the question Sarah knew was coming. "Are we going back?" Sarah looked up from her coffee. "What do you mean?" "To Crystal Lake." The little girl sat cross-legged on the living room floor, drawing, as usual. Sarah sighed. "I don't know." Lily frowned. "You miss him." Sarah nearly dropped her mug. "Lily." "What?" "You shouldn't say things like that." The child shrugged. "Why?" "Because children sometimes asked questions adults spent years avoiding." Sarah looked away. Out the window. Toward nothing. And everything. "I just need time to think." Lily nodded slowly, then returned to her drawing. 5 minutes later, she held up the picture. Sarah looked. It showed the cottage, the lake, the dock, and Ethan, standing beside them. Sarah's chest tightened. "That's nice." Lily lowered the paper. "No." "What?" "It's sad." Sarah stared. "Why?" "Because everybody's there except us." The drawing remained on the table long after the conversation ended. On the third evening, Sarah's grandmother finally had enough. Eleanor Bennett had spent 82 years on Earth, and she had very little patience for unnecessary suffering. She found Sarah sitting alone on the back porch, staring into space. Again, Eleanor sat beside her. For several moments she said nothing. Then, "You're in love with him." Sarah nearly choked. "Grandma." "What?" "Please don't." Eleanor smiled. "You think I'm wrong?" Sarah didn't answer, because she couldn't. The older woman nodded knowingly. "That's what I thought." Silence settled between them. Eventually Sarah spoke. "What if I was just convenient?" Eleanor turned toward her. "What if the booking wasn't an accident? What if the photograph wasn't an accident? What if somebody planned all of it?" Her grandmother listened patiently, then asked a simple question. "Did he plan the porch repairs?" Sarah blinked. "No." "Did he plan the pancakes?" "No." "Did he plan teaching Lily how to fish?" "No." "Did he plan carrying her backpack when she was tired?" Sarah looked away. "No." Eleanor smiled gently. "Then stop judging a man's heart based on things other people did." The words hit harder than Sarah expected, because deep down she already knew they were true. Back at Crystal Lake, Ethan spent the third evening sitting alone at the end of the dock. The sunset painted the water gold, the same way it always had. Yet everything felt different. He looked toward the cottage. Still empty. Still silent. His phone remained in his pocket. He had promised himself he would respect Sarah's request. 3 days. No calls. No texts. No pressure. 3 days. Even if it felt impossible. As darkness settled across the lake, he found himself touching his wrist automatically, looking for his father's watch. Then remembering. He had left it behind, on the kitchen table, beside her note. The realization brought an unexpected comfort. Because if Sarah had returned, she would see it, and she would understand. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know he hadn't walked away. Enough to know he intended to come back. Enough to know the watch wasn't an accident. Just like the pancakes. Just like the porch. Just like Crystal Lake. Just like her. And for the first time in 3 days, Ethan allowed himself to hope. Not much. Just enough. Because somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond the silence, beyond the fear, he could feel something shifting. Something important. Something that was bringing them back toward each other. Neither of them knew it yet. But the hardest part of their story was almost over. And the best part was about to begin. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah woke before sunrise. For a long time, she sat on the edge of the guest bed in her grandmother's house, staring at the pale light coming through the curtains. She hadn't slept much. Not really. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Crystal Lake. The dock. The cottage. The porch. And Ethan standing at the bottom of the steps promising he would come back. The worst part was that he had. He had kept every promise he had made all summer. Every single one. Yet somehow she had allowed fear to convince her otherwise. A soft knock sounded on the bedroom door. Her grandmother stepped inside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one over, then sat beside her. For a while, neither woman spoke. Finally, Eleanor sighed. "Are you ready to stop hiding?" Sarah smiled weakly. "I wasn't hiding." Her grandmother gave her a look. The kind that could dismantle lies without effort. "You drove 4 hours away because you were scared." Sarah stared into her coffee. "That's practically the definition of hiding." For the first time in days, Sarah laughed. A small laugh. But it was enough. Eleanor nodded. "Good." Then she stood. "Go home." Sarah looked up. "Just like that. Just like that. What if I'm wrong? What if you're right?" Sarah opened her mouth. Closed it. Then opened it again. "What if he already left?" Her grandmother smiled. "Then you'll know." The simplicity of the answer struck her. After all the fear. After all the overthinking. That was what it came down to. Knowing. Not guessing. Knowing. 2 hours later, Sarah and Lily were driving back to Crystal Lake. Neither spoke much. Lily spent most of the trip drawing. As usual, when the familiar road finally appeared ahead, Sarah felt her heart begin to pound. The closer they got, the harder it became to breathe. Then they turned into the driveway. The cottage appeared. Exactly the same. The porch, the dock, the lake. Everything looked unchanged. Yet Sarah immediately sensed something was different. The boathouse was empty. The SUV wasn't there. The dock sat silent beneath the afternoon sun. A feeling of disappointment hit her so suddenly it hurt. Maybe she was too late. Maybe he had finally given up. Lily jumped out first. "Mom." Sarah looked up. The little girl was pointing toward the kitchen window. Sarah hurried inside. The cottage was clean. Quiet. Empty. She walked into the kitchen. Then stopped. There, on the table exactly where she'd left her note, sat Ethan's watch. Her breath caught. For several seconds she simply stared at it. The silver case reflected sunlight from the window. Silent. Waiting. Sarah stepped forward slowly. She picked it up. The leather band was warm, as though someone had only recently taken it off. She sat down heavily in a chair. Lily climbed into the seat beside her. "That's Ethan's." Sarah nodded. "Why would he leave it?" Sarah looked down at the watch. She remembered how often he'd touched it. Whenever he was nervous. Whenever he was thinking. Whenever something mattered. He never went anywhere without it. Never. The realization hit her all at once. He hadn't left it accidentally. He had left it intentionally. Like a promise. Or maybe a question. Sarah swallowed hard. For the first time since she'd left Crystal Lake, she felt absolutely certain about one thing. Ethan hadn't been using her. He had been trusting her. An hour later, Sarah sat inside Margaret Wilson's post office. The elderly woman listened patiently while Sarah explained everything. Then Margaret shook her head. "About time." Sarah laughed despite herself. "Was I really that obvious?" Painfully. Margaret took a sip of tea. Then she told Sarah everything. About the merger. About the investigation. About Ethan staying away because he'd promised to respect her request. About him returning to the cottage every day just to check if she had come back. And finally, about the watch. He left it because he didn't know how to ask you to wait for him. Sarah looked up. "What?" Margaret nodded. Some men buy flowers. She pointed toward the watch. That man left the most important thing he owns. The room fell silent. Sarah stared down at the table, then finally asked the question she'd been avoiding. What do I do now? Margaret looked genuinely confused. You call him. Sarah blinked. That's it. That's it. Back in New York, Ethan sat alone in his apartment overlooking Central Park. The city looked exactly the way it always had. Busy, loud, restless. But it felt different now, because he no longer wanted to be there. The phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Normally he would ignore it. Something made him answer. Hello. Silence. Then, Ethan. His heart stopped. Sarah. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then finally, Sarah. The relief in his voice was impossible to hide. Neither of them tried. Sarah took a breath. I found your watch. Ethan closed his eyes. The tension he'd carried for days began to disappear. Slowly. Good. A small laugh escaped her. You sound nervous. I am. That surprised her. Ethan Carter wasn't supposed to sound nervous. Not billionaires. Not CEOs. Not powerful men who negotiated million-dollar deals. Yet he did. Very nervous. Ethan. Yeah. The watch is waiting. A long pause followed. Then. So am I. Sarah smiled. The kind of smile that arrives before tears. The kind that changes everything. When can you get here? Another pause. Then Ethan laughed. A real laugh. For the first time in days. Sarah. What? I'm already driving. For a second she thought she'd heard him wrong. What? I left New York 3 hours ago. Sarah covered her face. Half laughing. Half crying. You were coming anyway? Yes. Why? Ethan looked out at the highway stretching ahead of him. Because sometimes the truth was simple. Because sometimes love was simple. Because home is there. Sarah couldn't speak. Neither of them needed to. For the first time in a week, neither felt alone. And somewhere beyond the next stretch of road, Crystal Lake was waiting. So was their future. Ethan arrived at Crystal Lake just after sunset. The drive had taken longer than usual. Not because of traffic. Because he had stopped twice. The first time to buy flowers. The second time to throw the flowers away. By the time he reached the lake, he had convinced himself flowers were a terrible idea. Then convinced himself throwing them away had been an even worse idea. Now he stood at the bottom of the cottage steps with empty hands. And for a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals, he felt completely unprepared. The porch light was on. Warm yellow light spilled across the wooden boards. Inside, he could see movement through the screen door. A shadow. Then another. His heart pounded. He hadn't felt like this since he was a teenager. The screen door opened. Lily came flying out first. Ethan. Before he could react, she crashed into him. He laughed and caught himself just in time. You came back. I did. You took forever. It was 4 days. It felt like forever. He couldn't argue with that. A moment later, Sarah stepped onto the porch. For a few seconds, neither moved. The summer breeze drifted through the trees. The lake glimmered behind them. Everything seemed to hold its breath. Then Sarah held out his watch. Ethan looked at it. Then at her. Then back at the watch. I think this belongs to you. He stepped forward and took it carefully. The familiar weight settled into his palm. For years he had treated the watch like a connection to the past. Tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like a bridge. A bridge that had led him back here. Back to her. He fastened it around his wrist. Then instinctively pressed his thumb against the leather band. Sarah smiled immediately. What? She laughed softly. You always do that. Ethan looked down. He hadn't even noticed. I guess I do. Only when something matters. The truth of that hit harder than expected. Because right now everything mattered. Lily looked between them dramatically. Then sighed. You guys are weird. Sarah burst out laughing. Ethan followed a second later. The tension shattered instantly. And somehow that made everything easier. That evening they sat together on the dock. Just the three of them. The sun had disappeared below the trees. The water reflected thousands of tiny stars. For a long time nobody spoke. Then Sarah finally turned toward Ethan. I owe you an apology. No. I do. He shook his head. You got scared. I doubted you. You were protecting Lily. I still doubted you. Ethan stared out at the lake. Then smiled slightly. I probably would have done the same thing. Sarah studied him. Really? Absolutely. That answer surprised her. Because it was honest. and honesty had become one of the things she trusted most about him. After a moment, she reached into her pocket. The folded article. The one that had started everything. She handed it to him. I kept reading it. Ethan glanced at the headline and laughed. I hated this thing. So did I. Good. For a second they simply looked at each other. Then Sarah said the thing she'd been carrying for days. When I left, I wasn't really afraid of the article. Ethan waited. I was afraid of losing what we'd built. The confession hung in the air. Simple. Honest. Terrifying. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead he looked across the water. The dock. The boathouse. The cottage. The place where everything had changed. Then he looked back at her. So was I. Sarah's eyes filled unexpectedly. Neither of them looked away. Neither wanted to. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Ethan and Sarah remained on the porch. The lake was quiet. The world felt smaller somehow. Safer. Ethan leaned back in the rocking chair. Victoria called. Sarah smiled. That sounds dangerous. It usually is. What did she say? Ethan laughed. She said if I lose you, she's personally driving up here to hit me with a canoe. Sarah nearly choked on her tea. She did not. She absolutely did. Honestly? Honestly. Sarah laughed harder than she had in days. When she finally calmed down, Ethan became serious. She also said something else. What? He looked toward the lake. She said she's never seen me like this. Sarah's smile softened. Like what? Ethan thought about it, then answered honestly. Happy. The words settled between them. Quiet. Powerful. Real. For years Ethan had measured his life through achievements. Revenue. Growth. Acquisitions. Success. Yet none of those things had ever made him feel what he felt sitting here. On a simple cottage porch. Beside a woman who challenged him. A child who trusted him. And a lake that had accidentally changed everything. Or maybe not accidentally. Maybe Helen had been right. Maybe he hadn't needed another luxury property. Maybe he had needed a home. The next morning the town gathered for the annual Crystal Lake Community Festival. There were food stands, games, live music, children running everywhere, and enough homemade desserts to feed an army. Margaret Wilson stood in the middle of it all acting like she personally owned the event. Which, unofficially, she probably did. The moment she spotted Ethan and Sarah arriving together, she nodded smugly. I knew it. Sarah rolled her eyes. Knew what? Margaret grinned. Everything. No, you didn't. Close enough. Lily ran ahead toward the face-painting booth. Margaret watched her go, then looked back at Ethan. You staying? Ethan glanced toward Sarah, then toward the lake visible beyond the trees, then toward the little girl already waving at them from across the field. His answer came easily. Yeah. Margaret smiled. Took you long enough. For the rest of the afternoon, the town celebrated. But for Ethan, the most important moment happened just before sunset. Lily had fallen asleep against his shoulder after a long day of games and excitement. Sarah stood beside him near the lake, watching the water, watching the sky, watching the future quietly arrive. Neither spoke. They didn't need to, because for the first time since June, there were no questions left, only possibilities. And for the first time in a very long time, those possibilities felt beautiful.